Did you guys see Moscow today? Looks a little different than it did at the start of the full-scale invasion. But you know, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And this is that equal and opposite reaction. This was the largest air attack on Russia since the Second World War, eclipsing every previous Ukrainian air attack that has been done. And much of that air attack was concentrated around the Moscow area, meaning that before, when you would have air attacks that were concentrated on oil refineries that might have been past Moscow or might have been, closer to Ukraine, or ammo storage facilities, some electronics components factories, or, military factories, this was concentrated on many of those same targets, largely oil refineries, which is why you see such large black plumes of smoke like you do here. But on top of those attacks on these oil refineries, it was concentrated around the Moscow area, meaning not the first time, but for the largest scale and on, I would say, the largest impact, the amount of targets hit, the amount of smoke created, the amount that people heard the sounds during the daytime, the amount people saw drones and missiles flying between and over their buildings, the amount of social and psychological impact, it was bigger. On the actual size of the attack, it was bigger. And this is probably the most damage that has been done and seen by Russians of the entirety of the war. And there are so many different clips of this that I can show you where you can see Russian air defense systems doing their best to try to stop these drones as they fly right on past their interceptors. Sometimes they intercept, and there have been videos of that. Many other times, they did not. That right there is probably going to be one of the most famous images of the war. I mean that. One of the most famous images of the war. That mushroom cloud that launches the top of that container into the air around this oil facility. I mean, that is incredible to see that. I mean, look how many civilian apartment blocks are around this facility that can watch this, or looking outside their window, recording on their phones, how this is getting shared all over Telegram, all over Russian socials. And no matter what channel you turn to, whether you're looking on social media, looking outside your window, this is the war. It's also particularly interesting because the Moscow region is one of the most supportive, if not the most supportive region in all of Russia of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Absolutely terrifying, as war is. And this is an example of the war coming home. Terrible for the civilians. Whether or not it will bring about an end to the war through the Russian war machine being undermined through these types of strikes, through support for the war being undermined by these types of strikes, we have yet to wait and see. But the general economic forces for Russia does not trend in a positive direction when the machines that prop up its economy look like this and their people are talking like this. We effed around and found out. This translation was done by Visigrad24. Not a great primary source I'll put out there, but that's where the translation is from.
Пиздец, видишь, все горит там, блядь. Весь завод разухуярили, весь, блядь. Только ракеты, блядь, там долбят, блядь, еще где-то на подлете. Да выебывались, как говорится, блядь. У нас самое лучшее ПВО, блядь. Хохлы тоже, сука, хитрые, блядь, при поддержке, блядь, пиндосов. Ну, просто сплошное пожарище, блядь. Просто не видно на видео, там огонь вон. На, блядь. Еще где-то въебал, блядь. Вот он, блядь. Еще, блядь. Я не знаю, сколько штук уже поприлетал. Я уже штук 15 насчитал, блядь. Так началось, блядь. Пиздец. Просто пиздец.
We effed up. That's the last word he says, but you hear a lot of sentiments expressed there that are interesting. See, this is a guy that is not, you know, Slava Ukraini, Heroem Slava, right? This is a guy who's using slurs for Ukrainians when he's describing this attack, but you hear him saying, we effed up. And you start hearing like comments, like sarcastic comments about Russia's greatest air defense systems in the world when he can look out of his window and I mean, it looks like Mordor outside and just like the sky is darkening. When it started to get darker, I mean, that combined with the smoke clouds, it created a hellish image, especially when the fires were still lapping up. You can hear him express that like, well, on the camera, you can't even see the fires all that well. And on the right side, you can see the fires lapping up so high that they're reaching above the buildings, And either way, like this is quite incredible damage, but it also shows that if you are a Moscow resident, and again, the region that is the most supportive of the war, and you watch this happen, what type of conclusions could you get from this? Well, one could be you go and you read the Russian state press and newspapers, which even those will still have to express some concern here to show that they still live on planet Earth. But then you'll watch, you know, Solenyov Live, and you'll watch, you know, some other Russian state media programs, and you'll walk away and you'll say, well, this was terrible, but that shows exactly why we're fighting the war. It's to stop things like this from happening. Even though before the Russians invaded Ukraine, things like this were not happening. This is the largest air attack on Moscow since World War II. The common denominator here isn't that, oh my gosh, if we didn't invade Ukraine, then Moscow would be on fire. No, you invaded Ukraine, tried to light Kiev on fire, and that is why Moscow is on fire and Napoleon is long dead. That is why. And so it creates a difficult social dilemma on top of the economic pressure that is obvious with targeting Gazprom, Rosneft, and other Russian energy giants that help propel the war forward, both by funding the war effort directly through its contribution to Russian government coffers, but also through its direct contributions to the mercenary companies, the PMCs, that are attached to these companies. Which again, when you sanction these companies, you are not just sanctioning these direct companies that are financing the Russian government. You're sanctioning companies that are financing the Russian war machine. You're financing companies that directly, one point to another point, financing mercenary companies. Here is another clip of the damage where you can see both the smoke plumes rising in the distances from J of Kiev, big pro-Ukraine account, that has edges on every side. He posts the smoke plumes going up and some civilian buildings, it looks like, at least from here, that have caught on fire.
Black-pilled Kiwi has donated $5. It's the perfect analogy. The most iconic picture of the war is an oil tank explosion triggered by a wayward air defense. Poetry.
That is true. If you actually go, and I didn't want to go into it in detail, but if you go back and you actually see that one explosion of the refinery, and you see the oil, you know, tank explosion, that wasn't caused by a Ukrainian drone. Most of this damage was caused by Ukrainian drones. That was actually caused by a wayward air defense missile that slammed into the oil tanker and then caused that explosion, even though many of the other oil tanker explosions were caused by drones and Ukrainian missiles. In this case, when you look at this building, we don't see if it was a wayward air defense missile. It is also a large possibility, as is often here, that both the jamming of the drone's systems, of its navigation systems, or direct interception of the drones, which there have been multiple visual confirmations of drones that were intercepted during this attack that have been shared online. I didn't gather every clip of this attack, Trust me, if I wanted to do that, I would have to have been doing that all day. But that has been confirmed as well. And then the wreckage like slams into buildings. That's possible as well. Drones, it can also miss. That is also a possibility. But you can see here what looks like also some civilian buildings that have caught on fire. As well, of course, the large fire being from the gigantic burning oil facilities in the background. Yeah, no, these are very historic images. These are extremely historic images. When people talk about the war past this point, people are going to talk about these images, which is part of the reason right now I continuously keep looking at the air alert siren, because while the idea that the Russians are going to, you know, do some big, massive thing that they've never done before is probably not true, considering how many times the line has been crossed and we have heard that type of warning. It is true that the Russians will, of course, want to respond with their own massive air attacks. And so I've been watching the air attack map all stream, though I see nothing that is out of the ordinary outside of some activity in the Chernihiv region. Moving on, next clip, because we are still not done. Here is another thing that's interesting. These clips are fascinating to us. These clips will be fascinating to the history books. Yes, this is true. But these clips are also fascinating to decision makers right now in Western capitals and other capitals of Ukraine's potential partners and security acquaintances, we'll call them. People who will sell them weapons like Serbia, but maybe not necessarily is, you know, gonna be there, you know, Slava Ukraini in the capital. Another image affects them. This image of burning wreckage, this image of burning refineries. Oh my gosh, Russia the behemoth is being attacked in Moscow. Russia the behemoth is being attacked. The war is being brought back to Moscow. And so the Russian defense industry obviously is feeling the pain, but the Ukrainian defense industry sees an advertising opportunity. Take clips of the damage done to many of these refineries, many of these factories. Take the giant black plumes of smoke, which create quite a striking image, put it on a big screen, take some prototype or, you know, model missiles of our weapons and go put it at a defense convention so that all of the defense companies walking by see it, but more importantly, all the lawmakers and people who work in procurement who are looking for new systems and looking for new investments, when the Ukrainian drone industry right now isn't suffering from a lack of capacity to expand when it comes to, you know, factory space or even manpower. What the Ukrainians are, even though of course, you know, they could use more hands, they are actually suffering from a lack of capital investment. If they had more capital, they could produce more drones that would only make Russian advances even that much more costlier. If they had more capital, they could invest more in missiles. They can invest in all these other industries. There's other things that Ukraine could do to help with its capital. Continued crackdowns on corruption so we don't have more military jacket scandals, hostile military administration scandals, scandals with Yarmak, scandals when it comes to defensive fortifications for energy facilities, and whether if somebody gives a kickback and doesn't, that depends upon whether their facility is going to actually get protected. You know, which decides whether people get vital, you know, support. It depends upon whether or not energy staff gets protected or don't get protected for those who actually work in these facilities. It was quite nefarious. This is something that can be done and should be pursued in NAPU and SAPU and organizations like that. They should continue to pursue that corruption. But ultimately, anti-corruption efforts cannot just make capital appear out of thin air. It can make spilling that capital through waste and fraud out of the boat more difficult. But you still need the capital to come from somewhere. And that's why the Ukrainians are working with the Saudis. That's why the Ukrainians are working with the United Arab Emirates. That's why the Ukrainians are working with other Middle Eastern powers to show the effectiveness of their interceptor drones, to show the experience of their drone teams and their general institutional knowledge, that shows how their systems are integrated and how they develop that system integration, and to show that they're even in some instances willing to put their personnel on the line if it means that the capital that these wealthy Gulf states have access to could be invested into Ukraine's defense industry, which then through its outflows helps make Ukraine stronger. And advertisements like this, big events like this, not to say that an air attack is an advertisement, but in this context, when they're literally putting it in front of visual presentations, in front of the missiles themselves, while trying to show this at defense conventions, yes, it is being used as an advertisement, even if the purpose wasn't an advertisement. Maybe even if the decision makers knew it would be an advertisement to the Russian public that continuing this war is not a good idea. How far have we come? How far have we come? I mean, you guys remember, right? You guys remember what the commentary was before. If the United States gives Ukraine Tomahawk missiles, that could cause World War III. Oh my gosh, a drone blew up next to this flag near the Kremlin. My goodness, this could be the start of World War III. Oh my gosh, the United States said that they could use ATACMS to strike Russian forces that were attacking Ukraine from across the border. This could be the start of World War III. Now, Ukraine has the ability to attack Moscow, Russia's capital, 400 kilometers from Ukraine's border, at mass, at scale, with not just attack drones, but with missiles. When before this war, one of Russia's big demands, and during this war, at the start, when they invaded, one of their demands during the Istanbul negotiations was Ukraine must demilitarize and Ukraine can have no weapon that can go over 125 kilometers. Well, now Ukraine can not only attack Moscow, Ukraine can attack Moscow with ease. When we're talking about questions of range, that's not a problem anymore. There is very little range constraint on Ukrainian military. Of course, there are still targets deeper in Russia that the Ukrainians would like to hit. I'm sure if they could extend it a few extra 100 kilometers, that would put more refineries in danger, more industry that supports the Russian war machine in danger, especially as Russia might have to start considering putting their defense industry further and further east, which of course takes the components further and further away from the war and further strains their transportation industry, which has already faced many wartime constraints. But still, when it comes to range and it comes to where the vast majority of Russia's population lies, Ukraine has that in range. When it comes to where the vast majority of its industry has lied, and currently lies, that is in range. And when it comes to the oil refineries that are not in range, they are quickly becoming in range. And the factories that they could move east, they are quickly coming in range before they even move them east, meaning they would have to move them. Like, we're going to have to talk about like missile factories or drone factories in places like Vladivostok, or exactly what air defense systems can they guide around? Can they put around? Because again, Russia is the largest country on earth, which has been a strategic benefit for it in many situations. But right now, at this moment of time, it is not. When I talked on these programs on Twitch, which of course is the circuit I can run, when I would talk to different programs, debate panels, or different shows about how Ukraine wins in the sense of, brings the Russians to the negotiating table to negotiate with them in good faith in a way that they're going to have to acknowledge that they're their neighbor because they cannot subjugate them at the battlefield. For them to be able to do that, they're going to have to fight a long-range war. They're going to have to use Russia's natural attribute, its size, against it, and make it so that its air defense systems are so strained and the area of land that it has to protect is so vast that they're not able to protect everything at the same time. And so ultimately they have to pick and choose, or stretch out their systems in such a manner that they protect nothing, or having to choose basically, what they leave defenseless. Whether they leave their population center defenseless, whether they leave their defense industry defenseless, whether they leave their oil and gas industry defenseless, whether they leave the positions closer to the front defenseless. They cannot protect it all. It is impossible. And this this impossible to escape dilemma, this dilemma that they're not getting away from, it has come to its natural conclusion. The conclusion for those who have been monitoring the war through spreadsheets and graphs, seeing the general trends of the war, knew was coming, has come. And that is, the Ukrainians can attack the Russians at scale. The Ukrainians can not only attack them at scale, but the Russians cannot defend themselves at scale. And so when the Ukrainians attack, it will hurt the Russians. When the Ukrainians attack, it will penetrate through their air defense systems. When the Ukrainians attack, the Russians will stretch out their systems. And when the Ukrainians attack, the Russians will have to expend more of them, only making the problems worse. This is not the conclusion. This will only get worse for the Russians. The air attacks will only get bigger. The missile attacks will only get bigger. Firepoint, which is the company that put this display at this convention, they're only expanding Flamingo FP2 missile production. The long-range drone production is only expanding, and there are now other capital investors coming into Ukraine. Key decisions have been made. Decisions about Ukraine being able to export weapons, which has brought other investors into the Ukrainian market, and the performance of Ukraine's interceptors have brought more attention to them, therefore also garnering more capital, garnering more ability to both stretch out Russian attacks, you know, as in stretch out the resources, grind them down, as well as grind down what is fundamentally underlying the war effort, which is the military-industrial complex and the oil and gas industry, which finances it. So I will say, obviously, the Russians still have a large drone arsenal. The Russians still have a large missile arsenal. And in total size, it is still larger than Ukraine. But Russia, in total size, is also larger than Ukraine, which means they have a lot more to protect. And when it comes to relative size, the Ukrainians are the ones expanding more rapidly. And that's clear. And so the Russians need to think of some counters, or they're going to need to think what they cut next or what they do next, because this current status quo cannot be kept in perpetuity.